Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. When I look at the state of the big two comic publishers, Marvel and DC, I look at two companies that are in two different states of trouble. And when I look at both of these companies, they don't look like they are in any sort of competitive position as publishers. And I look at their futures and they look quite bleak. Now, on the Marvel side, I look at things as falling apart these days because they had a big slump due to their campaign to allegedly diversify their catalog of characters. And that alleged campaign to diversify their catalog of characters has led to a major sales slump in their catalog. Now, on the DC side, they have managed to try to pick things up with this Rebirth event. Unfortunately, it really has not really built the momentum it really has needed because this storyline is just going too long. And I look at both companies and I see them both in some serious dire straits. And the dire straits that they're in may pretty much impact the comic book industry long term. And I'm looking at both companies and I see the free fall that both companies are in, and I'm thinking that we're headed towards rock bottom. Now, a lot of people think that rock bottom is what we experienced in the comic book industry in 1993 when the industry collapsed due to the speculator boom, but that wasn't the case at all. Now, that was a major slump and it was a major hit to the industry that pretty much collapsed much of the speculator infrastructure, but the comic book publishing infrastructure remained intact. There was still a Marvel, there was still a DC, and there was a place for indies, and there were comic shops to distribute comic books. So the infrastructure still remained intact. That's not rock bottom. Rock bottom is something completely different, and rock bottom is what the comic book industry experienced in the period of the 1950s. Now, during the 1950s, after the Golden Age ended in the late 40s, that was rock bottom. And that was pretty much exacerbated by a lack of demand for superhero comics and a lack of demand for comics in general. Moreover, it was made worse when the Dr. Frederick Wertham came out with that seduction of the innocent and pointed out all of these undertones and innuendos in comics that may or may not have possibly been there, and that became a media sensation with the congressional hearings, and that pretty much put the nail in the coffin for the American comic book for at least a decade and a half due to that seduction of the innocent in those congressional hearings. And that's what led to pretty much a major collapse of the comic book industry, pretty much the rock bottom, because after the end of that seduction of the innocent, what had happened was many of these publishers were forced to go out of business. Many types of genres were pretty much taken off the shelf, and pretty much many artists and writers wound up out of work. And that type of collapse, I think, is coming to the comic book industry, and I don't think many at the big two or in the indies are ready for that type of collapse, because that is the rock bottom that I believe is coming. That's pretty much, where everything is going right now, because when I look at many of today's comic book publishers, they just don't have a vision for the future. They don't have a direction they want to go in for the future, and they don't have any idea of what type of stories to write and sell to today's customer. Many of today's comic book publishers are still sadly stuck in the past, and many are still stuck in the 1990s, not only with brand-wise, but craft-wise as well. And what many people don't understand about the comic book industry in the 1990s is that a lot of artists who came up in that time, their craft really was not very good, and their art style pretty much was not proportional. It wasn't very visual. It was just meant to imitate one or two or three artists like Rob Liefeld's or Jim Lee's or Todd McFarlane's, and it wasn't about being unique. And a lot of guys came up in the 90s, they didn't learn things about scale and perspective and proportion, and that's why their art always comes across as a little off. Now, people who came up in the 2000s, their art craft was a lot better and their writing craft was a lot better because they know how to tell a story a little bit better and their visual style is a little better. I noticed when people came up in the 2000s, their craft was a little better because in the slump, they had to learn how to do things the traditional way, whereas these other guys that came up in the 90s, they pretty much learned they could do whatever they wanted. And the whole thing with the editorial is that we had a lot of guys who came up in the 90s. And a lot of guys who came up in the 90s, they are still thinking that they can, manipulate the market the way they did with these speculator booms. And that's why they're doing all these reboots and all these new #1 issues. And that's really has been driving the comic book industry into a free fall. What these guys don't understand is that publishing is a marathon. It's not a sprint, and you have guys in the editorial departments at Marvel, DC, and some of these indies who are still trying to sprint to big number sales. And then you have other guys who are sitting there trying to speculate on who's going to make the next Fantastic Four #1, the next Giant Size X-Men #1, and who's going to make the next hot property by using existing characters. And both of these business approaches are sending the overall comic book industry into a tailspin on the publication side. And again, these guys just don't understand that publishing is a marathon, it is not a sprint. And in order for a comic book publisher like a Marvel or a DC to survive during a extended slump period like we have been in since the 1990s, since the last industry collapsed, you have to have a comprehensive plan for taking that company to navigate that course. And we really, with DC, they fell apart when they hired Dan Dido, who had no publishing experience, and Marvel has been mismanaged by Axel Alonso for the last couple of years, especially with this last diversity campaign that has pretty much sent their sales into free fall. And neither guy has any vision, and neither do some of the other people they have, like Jeff Johns, who's trying to do everything instead of trying to find business professionals and publishing professionals to help him navigate a course. Because again, I will say it one more time, publishing is a marathon, not a sprint, and you have to understand how to run a marathon course in order to run a publishing house. And with Marvel and DC, they don't know how to run a publishing house, and many of the indies don't know how to run a marathon in a publishing house. They're still trying to sprint and get these 100,000 sales or these 60,000 sales instead of trying to build an audience. Because in order for a comic to gain towards a certain point where they can reach the 150, 200,000 and maintain that level, plateau at that level, that requires you to go through some pain. That means you're going to have to stick with some titles during the slower periods, and you're going to have to go out and promote. And what's the big problem in the comic book industry is that no one wants to go out and do the heavy lifting. No one wants to go out and do the hard work. They want to try to shock market you, get you to go buy this #1 issue, and then they sit there and wonder why the book does not continue to maintain its momentum. Well, in publishing, again, it's like this. It takes time for a book to build an audience. It takes time for the audience to discover a book. And if you cancel a book by the 8th or 9th issue, the customer doesn't have an incentive to try the book, and they don't have an incentive to keep buying the book. So any smart publisher like Stan Lee was back in the day, they stuck with titles that were struggling, and they tried to help them build an audience. They built the audience by doing different things like different types of promotions and doing things like keeping prices low and making deals with distributors to keep certain titles on the shelf. And I don't see any sort of business plan at the Big Two or any of these other publishers towards trying to build an audience. It's like if a book dies at the 12th issue, they don't try to make an effort to try to save it and try to keep it moving to the 13th or the 14th issue. What I've learned from my experience publishing books is that sometimes it may take a year, 2 years, or 3 years for a book to find an audience. And today's publishers in the comic book world, they're too busy trying to sell to speculators instead of trying to sell to readers. And it may take 2 or 3 years for a book to find an audience with readers. And you have to be able to take those losses in the short term in order to gain the successes in the long term. And a lot of people in the comic book world, they're just not playing the long game. They're playing the short game with these relaunches and reboots, and they're getting the short audience, but you have to have a long game if you want to try to maintain the overall state of the industry. And because nobody's trying to maintain the state of the overall industry, that's why I think we're headed towards a course of rock bottom. Because rock bottom is where a lot of people are going to be out of work, and a lot of people are going to be out of pain, and a lot of pain, because there aren't going to be any jobs, and it's going to be mostly guys self-publishing who are the only ones who are going to survive, and they're the only ones who are going to have properties, whereas the big two is just going to go into reprints, because it's just going to cost too much for them to continue publishing books, because they just don't have the resources and the infrastructure. Even with Time Warner and Disney owning them, it's just going to cost too much for them to continue to keep relaunching books and publishing books when there is no audience for the book. And the reason why that is because of the models for business that people are using right now, because their editors just don't have the editorial vision, nor do they have the publishing background to understand how to build an audience. And building an audience, again, it's a long process. It may take 2 years. It may take 3 years. It may take 4 years. It may take 5 years. But when customers see the product on the shelf on a regular basis, that's what's going to give them an incentive to try that title. And the only thing that's going to get them that incentive to try the title is if the stories are good. And it's hard to have stories that are good, because once you have all these events going on, it's hard for a creative team to build any sort of momentum. And one of the things I learned as a writer is that you have to build momentum when you're writing a story. When you're writing a story, you have the starting point, then you have the rising action, and what happens is you have this event come along, and that cuts the rising action off, and that doesn't give the reader an incentive to buy the book anymore, because just as you started buying the adventures of this character, all of a sudden we have this event come in, and then that storyline doesn't resume for a year, and then instead of building to the climax of the first story arc in the comic, what happens is everything just flatlines, and then when the reboot comes, everything crashes down, and the reader pretty much, again, has no incentive to even think about buying these comics or trying them. This is why it's important for each character to have individual stories, and for, as I see it, for the next couple of years, just do away with the event model, because we want the readers to find the characters, and if they find the characters, they'll start getting interested in stories. And I look at the comic book industry, and again, this lack of vision is why the industry is in a slump. You really need a publishing professional who understands stories and understands storytelling to be their editor-in-chief at Marvel and DC, so they can set a course for both companies. And even some of these indies need an editor-in-chief with a vision towards developing characters and stories, because characters are what sell comic books. Comics are a visual medium, and we're not seeing anybody trying to sell characters anymore. These days, everybody's trying to sell an event with a lot of characters, and when you try to sell events with lots of characters, what happens is you don't get to know the characters as people, you don't get to know their stories, you don't get to know their mission, and you can't build an audience that way. The only way you can really, again, build an audience, is with trying to write good stories and trying to let these characters stand on their own. Unfortunately, today's comic book publishers just don't want to do the work, and that's why I believe the industry, again, is going to hit a rock bottom. But the only positive thing to come from rock bottom is that people will have finally acknowledged the real problems going on in the comic book industry, and then maybe at that point we can get some people in charge who have some sort of vision for the future and can set a course towards building the comic book infrastructure towards reaching the next generation of readers in a way that's more constructive than this dysfunctional approach that many have learned in the 90s and still try to apply in the 21st century. Maybe when we hit rock bottom, we can reach a point where we can start creating a new course to reach the new readers of the 21st century. If you like what you've seen on this channel, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of the SJS Direct titles, you can do so by clicking the link to the Amazon.com in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.